Welcome to Chapter 14, Two Societies at War from 1861 to 1865. Let's get started. Secession and Military Stalemate from 1861 to 1862. The Secession Crisis. The Civil War was called the war between the states by Southerners and the War of Rebellion by Northerners. On December 20th, 1860, the South Carolina Convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Fire eaters elsewhere in the Deep South quickly followed. The secessionists met in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861 and proclaimed a new nation, the Confederate States of America. They adopted a new constitution and named Jefferson Davis as its provisional president. Secessionist fervor was less intense in the four slave states of the Middle South, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, where there were fewer slaves and their leaders urged compromise. In December of 1860, President James Buchanan declared secession illegal but denied that the federal government had the authority to restore the Union by force. South Carolina demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter, a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor. President Buchanan refused to order the Navy to resupply the fort. The Crittenden Compromise. Congress responded with a compromise, the Crittenden Plan, which called for a constitutional amendment that would permanently protect slavery from federal interference in any state where it already existed. Crittenden's second provision called for the westward extension of the Missouri Compromise line to the California border. Slavery would be barred north of the line and protected to the south, including any territories hereafter acquired. Lincoln upheld the first part of the Crittenden Plan to protect slavery where it already existed, but was not willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the California border because that would lead to further expansion. Lincoln declared that secession was illegal and that acts against the Union constitute insurrection. He would enforce federal laws as well as continue to possess federal property in seceded states. The Upper South will choose sides. Jefferson Davis forced the surrender of Fort Sumter on April 14, 1861. Lincoln called in state militiamen to put down the insurrection. Although some Northerners were wary of Lincoln's Republican administration, they remained supportive of the Union's cause and responded positively to Lincoln's call for the mobilization of the militias. The states of the Middle and Border South were forced to choose sides in the dispute. Support from these states was crucial to the Confederacy because of these states' high populations' access to industry and fuel. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy after the fall of Fort Sumter. Lincoln reacted quickly and ordered General McClellan to secure railway lines between Washington and the Ohio River and western Virginia. Farmers opposed to secession now had opportunity to vote for a breakaway territory, West Virginia. It joined the Union in 1863. Delaware voted to stay in the Union, and Unionists secured control of Maryland. The Union retained control over Missouri in part owing to the support of German Americans. After Confederate loss in September 1861, Kentucky stayed with the Union. Setting war objectives and devising strategies. Jefferson Davis focused on the defense of the Confederacy rather than conquering Western territories. The Confederacy only needed a military stalemate to guarantee independence. Lincoln portrayed secession as an attack on popular government, and he insisted on an aggressive military strategy and a policy of unconditional surrender. In July of 1861, General P.G.T. Beauregard's Confederate troops routed General Irvin McDowell's troops near Manassas Creek, also called Bull Run. Lincoln replaced McDowell with George B. McClellan and enlisted an additional 1 million men, who would serve for 3 years in the newly created Army of the Potomac. In 1862, McClellan launched a thrust toward Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital, but he moved too slowly and allowed the Confederates to mount a counterattack. A Confederate army under Stonewall Jackson marched north up the Shenandoah Valley in western Virginia and threatened Washington, D.C. General Robert E. Lee launched an attack outside Richmond and suffered heavy casualties, but McClellan failed to exploit the advantage and Richmond remained secure. Lee moves north. Antietam. Jackson and Lee routed a Union army in the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862. The Battle of the Antietam Creek on September 17, 1862, was the bloodiest single day in U.S. military history. Jackson's troops arrived just in time to save Lee's troops from defeat. Lincoln replaced General McClellan with Ambrose Burnside, who later resigned and was replaced by Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker. The War in the Mississippi Valley. The Union dominated the Ohio River Valley, and in 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant took Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. In April, a Confederate army caught Grant by surprise near Shiloh. Grant forced a Confederate withdrawal but suffered a great number of casualties. Union naval forces, commanded by David G. Farragut, captured New Orleans, the South's financial center and largest city, giving it a base for future naval operations. Union victories in the West had significantly undermined Confederate strength in the Mississippi River Valley. What is total war? Using all resources in a war effort. It was used by the North first, later by the South. The military carnage of 1862 forced both sides into total war, utilizing all the resources of both nations to win at all costs. Although the armies of both sides could initially count on volunteers to fill their ranks, both governments had to resort to conscription. After the defeat at Shiloh in April 1862, the Confederate Congress imposed the first legally binding draft in American history. The Confederate draft had two loopholes. It exempted one white man for each 20 slaves on a plantation, and it allowed drafted men to hire substitutes. Some Southerners refused to serve, and the Confederate government lacked the power to compel them. The Confederate Congress overrode state judges' orders to free conscripted men. To prevent sabotage and concerted resistance to the war effort in the Union, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and imprisoned about 15,000 Confederate sympathizers without trial. He also extended martial law to civilians who discouraged enlistment or resisted the draft. The Union government's Militia Act of 1862 set a quota of volunteers for each state, which was increased by the Enrollment Act of 1863. The Union also allowed men to avoid military service by providing a substitute or paying a $300 fee. Hostility to the Enrollment Act of 1863 draft into African Americans spilled into the streets of New York City, where Irish and German workers sacked the homes of Republicans, killed a dozen African Americans, and forced hundreds of black families from their homes. Lincoln rushed in Union troops to suppress the insurrection. The Union Army Medical Bureau and the United States Sanitary Commission provided medical services to the soldiers and tried to prevent deaths from disease, which killed more men than did the fighting. The Confederate health system was poorly organized, and soldiers died from camp diseases at a higher rate than Union soldiers. High death numbers contributed to the creation of modern funeral practices and establishment of military cemeteries. The destructive war also produced a new cult of mourning among the middle and upper classes. Women in wartime. Women took a leading role in the Sanitary Commission and other wartime agencies. Dorothea Dix was the first woman to receive a major federal appointment. Women staffed growing bureaucracies, volunteered to serve as nurses, and filled positions traditionally held by men. A number of women took on military duties as spies, scouts, and disguised as men, soldiers. Mobilizing resources. The Union entered the war with a distinct advantage. Its economy was far superior to the South's, and its arms factories were equipped for mass production. The Confederates had substantial industrial capacity, and by 1863 they were able to provide every infantryman with a modern rifle musket. Confederate leaders counted on King Cotton to provide revenue to purchase clothes, boots, blankets, and weapons from abroad. The British government never recognized the independence of the Confederacy, but it did recognize the rebel government as a belligerent power with the right under international law to borrow money and to purchase weapons. To sustain the allegiance of Northerners to their party while bolstering the Union's stability to fight the war, the Republicans raised tariffs, created a national banking system, devised a system of internal improvements, especially railroads, and developed the Homestead Act of 1862. Congress's authorization for the construction of a transcontinental railroad in 1862 encouraged the allegiance of farmers, workers, and entrepreneurs and allowed the Union to fight a protracted war. Railroads connected new industries, manufacturing guns, clothes, and food, with resources in the Union Army. Bankers and financiers benefited from the government's modern system of public finance. Republicans financed the war by imposing broad-based taxes, issuing U.S. Treasury bonds, and creating a national monetary system through the Legal Tender Act of 1862, which authorized the printing of paper money, soon known as greenbacks. The new fiscal system resulted in the concentration of capital in the hands of industrialists and financiers and appeared to threaten the small producer society and future of democratic self-government. The Confederate government's economic policy changed from reliance on states to centralization. The Davis administration built and operated shipyards, armories, foundries, and textile mills, commandeered food and raw materials, requisitioned slaves to work on fortifications, and directly controlled foreign trade. The Confederate Congress and ordinary people opposed Davis's initiatives, fearing strong government and high taxes. The government financed about 60% of its war expenses with unbacked paper money, which created inflation, resulted in riots, and led to the violation of citizens' property rights in order to sustain the war. The turning point, 1863, Emancipation, contraband. As war casualties mounted in 1862, Lincoln and some Republican leaders accepted Frederick Douglass's argument and began to redefine the war as a struggle against slavery. Exploiting the disorder of wartime, tens of thousands of slaves escaped and sought refuge behind Union lines, where they were known as contrabands. Congress passed the first Confiscation Act in 1861, which authorized the seizure of all property, including slaves, used to support the rebellion. In April 1862, Congress, influenced by radical Republicans, enacted legislation ending slavery in the District of Columbia. In June, it enacted the Wilmot Proviso. In July 1862, the Second Confiscation Act declared forever free all fugitive slaves and all slaves captured by the Union Army. The Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln initially opposed emancipation as a war goal, but cautiously gave in to pressure by radical Republicans and escaped slaves. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued a preliminary proclamation of emancipation on September 22, 1862, offering rebel states to return to the Union prior to January 1863 and thus preserve slavery in their borders. The proclamation did not immediately free all slaves, as it authorized slavery to continue in the border states, areas already under Union control, and Indian Territory. However, the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1, 1863, changed the nature of the conflict. Union troops became agents of liberation. The proclamation was controversial in the South as well as in the North, where Democrats feared race warfare and competition for employment. Vicksburg and Gettysburg. The Battle of the Mississippi. In 1862, Democrats gained seats in Congress as popular support was growing for a negotiated peace. General Lee's army defeated Union forces at Fredericksburg in December 1862 and at Chancellorsville in May 1863, which further eroded Northern support for the war. General Grant aimed to split the Confederacy and search for a decisive victory. Vicksburg, Mississippi surrendered to the Union Army on July 4, 1863, followed by Port Hudson, Louisiana 5 days later, which established Union control of the entire Mississippi River. Grant had cut off Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. Hundreds of slaves deserted their plantations. General Lee suggested that instead of sending the army to Tennessee, the Confederacy should invade the North to either force Grant to move east or win a decisive battle that would break the North's will to fight. Lee's advance and defeat. Confederate and Union armies met at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The 3-day battle was a great Union victory, but also the most lethal battle of the Civil War. After Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, the tide of the war turned. Republicans reaped political gains in their elections, while Confederate elections went sharply against politicians who supported Davis. The Confederates' defeats at Vicksburg and Gettysburg ended their prospect of winning foreign recognition and acquiring advanced weapons from the British. British manufacturers were no longer dependent on the South for cotton. However, they were dependent on the North for cheap wheat. Also, the British championed the abolitionist cause and wanted to avoid provoking a well-armed United States. The Union victorious, 1864 to 1865. Soldiers and strategy. The impact of black troops. Lincoln initially refused to consider blacks for military service. Nonetheless, by 1862, some African Americans had formed their own volunteer regiments in New England, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Kansas. The Emancipation Proclamation changed popular thinking and military policy. Some Northern whites argued that if blacks were to benefit from a Union victory, they should share in the fighting and dying. As white resistance to conscription increased, the Lincoln administration was recruiting as many African Americans as it could. Military service did not end racial discrimination, yet African Americans volunteered for the Union military service in disproportionate numbers. Capable generals take command. Lincoln placed Ulysses S. Grant in charge of all Union armies and directed him to advance against all major Confederate forces simultaneously. They wanted a decisive victory before the election of 1864. Grant knew how to fight a modern war that relied on technology and focused on an entire society, and he was willing to accept heavy casualties in assaults on strongly defended positions in the belief that attempts of earlier Union commanders to conserve life through cautious tactics had prolonged the war. Lee was narrowly victorious in the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. At Cold Harbor, Grant severely eroded Lee's forces, yet the Union losses were even greater. Stalemate. Union and Confederate soldiers suffered through protracted trench warfare around Richmond and Petersburg. The enormous casualties and military stalemate threatened Lincoln with defeat in the November 1864 election. To punish farmers who provided the base for Jubal Early and food for Lee's army, Grant ordered General Philip H. Sheridan to turn the region into a barren waste. Sheridan's troops conducted a scorched earth campaign, destroying grain, barns, and any other resource useful to the Confederates. Grant's decision to carry the war to Confederate civilians changed the definition of conventional warfare. The election of 1864 and Sherman's March. The National Union Party versus the Peace Democrats. In 1864, the Republican Convention endorsed Lincoln's war measures, demanded the surrender of the Confederacy, and called for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. The Republican Party temporarily renamed itself the National Union Party and nominated Democrat Andrew Johnson for vice president. The Democrats divided into War Democrats who wanted to continue fighting and the Peace Democrats who wished an immediate end to fighting, nominated at their convention General George McClellan, who promised to recommend an immediate armistice and peace convention if elected. The fall of Atlanta and Lincoln's victory. On September 2, 1864, William T. Sherman forced the surrender of Atlanta, Georgia. Sherman's success resulted in celebrations in the North. deep pessimism in the Confederacy, McClellan's abandonment of the peace platform, and Republican empowerment. Lincoln won a decided victory in November, and Republicans increased their majorities in Congress. The pace of emancipation accelerated. Maryland and Missouri freed their slaves, followed by Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana. On January 31st, 1865, the Republican-dominated Congress approved the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery throughout the United States. William Tecumseh Sherman, the hard war warrior. Sherman's philosophy of war defined civilians as enemies and combatants who should feel the effect of war. He declined to follow the Confederate Army into Tennessee after the capture of Atlanta. Instead, he wanted to cut a swath through to the sea that would devastate Georgia and score a psychological victory. After burning Atlanta, Sherman destroyed railroads, property, and supplies during his 300-mile march to the sea. Many Confederate soldiers deserted and fled home to protect their farms and families. Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, setting aside hundreds of thousands of acres of captured land for the exclusive use of freedmen. In February 1865, Sherman invaded South Carolina with a desire to wreak vengeance upon the state where secession had begun. The Confederate Collapse. Because of class resentment from poor whites, the Confederacy had such a manpower shortage that they were going to arm the slaves in exchange for their freedom. The war ended before this had a chance to transpire. The symbolic end of the war occurred on April 9, 1865, when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. By May, the Confederate Army and government had dissolved. For the South, the Union armies had destroyed slavery as well as the Confederacy and much of the South's economy. Almost 260,000 Confederate soldiers paid for secession with their lives. For the North, the struggle had preserved the Union and destroyed slavery, but the cost of victory was enormous in terms of money, resources, and lives, with over 360,000 Union soldiers dead and thousands more maimed. The war had also set into motion a new industrial and financial order in the North, but had not entirely ended the sectional struggle. So a quick review: the election of 1860, the border South, total war, how the North paid for the war, and the Emancipation Proclamation. That is it for Chapter 14. And until next time, thanks for watching.